Hi. Hi, everyone. Hi, good evening. Thank you, everyone, for coming on such a wonderful day, such a beautiful day outside. We're really pleased you're all inside with us. I'd like to welcome you to the Queer Asia Conference 2018, Bodies Ex Borders, being held at SOAS, University of London, University College London, and the Film Festival at SOAS and the British Museum from the 24th to the 29th of June. My name is Jennifer Ng Lo. I'm one of the organisers of the Queer Asia Conference this year. So we at Queer Asia are pleased to welcome you to our keynote panel and reception, featuring Professor Geeta Patel from the University of Virginia, Professor Suen Yu Tung from the Chinese University of Hong Kong, Dr Vanja Hamzić from SOAS, University of London, and chaired by Dr Noor Abu Asad from the Centre for Transnational Development and Collaboration. This keynote event is sponsored by the SOAS South Asia Institute, the SOAS China Institute, and the SOAS Centre for Gender Studies. The drinks reception after the panel is sponsored by the SOAS South Asia Institute. And thank you very much to them. So, just to begin with a few words about our platform and activities this year. Queer Asia is a network of queer-identifying scholars, academics, activists, filmmakers, artists, and performers. The conference and film festival, along with our run-up events throughout the year, provide a platform for inter-Asia collaboration, dialogue, and research on issues affecting people who self-identify as LGBTQI+, or belong to other non-normative sexualities and gender identities in Asia or Asian diasporas and beyond. This is our third annual conference and second annual film festival. Since its inception in 2016, Queer Asia's annual activities have grown from 2 days in 2016 to 3 days in 2017 and now 5 days in 2018. In turn, our budget has increased from around 3,000 fundraised in 2016 to 8,000 fundraised in 2017 and around 12,000 fundraised this year. So we'd like to thank all of our sponsors, many of whom are based here at SOAS, and also our generous crowdfunding donors, without whom none of this would have been possible. So thank you very much. In terms of participation, conference speakers have increased from around 30 in 2016 to around 60 this year over the 2 days. In turn, through the drive and determination of one colleague in particular, Daniel Luther, our film festival has grown from 2 films in 2016 to 18 films by 10 directors in 2017 to 33 films this year. Around 500 people attended our annual activities last year. In terms of size, our organisation and platform has grown exponentially, revealing the desire and need for opportunities for queer communities to come together and share their work and experiences. Our focus is on providing a platform for a range of voices, identities, and experiences of those who identify as queer and Asian. We encourage diversity by including voices from a multitude of Asian backgrounds, including West Asia or the Middle East, Central Asia and the Caucasus, South Asia, Southeast Asia, and East Asia, and of course Asian diasporas. We tend not, however, to identify by geographical region, but are open to exploring Asian queer experience in whatever form. And this can be seen by the spread of activities over the next 2 days here, well, tonight and the next 2 days, including talks and panels, to name a few events, on Central Asia and the Caucasus, Myanmar, Palestine, the UNDP's Being LGBTI in Asia project, Asian queer activism in the US, and refugee experiences. We also have 2 plays on this year, one from India and one from Pakistan. We have panel and individual speakers from countries that include Thailand, Hong Kong, India, Kyrgyzstan, Singapore, Bangladesh, Turkey, Malaysia, Azerbaijan, South Korea, the Philippines, and China, as well as diaspora from the UK, Europe, and the US. The Bodies Ex Borders art exhibition features 13 Asian artists exploring themes related to gender and sexuality, as well as other marginalised topics such as religion, refugee and immigrant status, displacement, mental illness, and caste discrimination. There's going to be a short performance, actually, during our reception tonight by one of the artists participating this year, Nayoung Jeong, which is entitled Tracing Bodies, so we hope you'll join us for that after. Our film festival, the main days of which are held this year at the British Museum on 24th and 29th June, feature films from countries that include the Philippines, Myanmar, India, China, Palestine, Thailand, Indonesia, Hong Kong, Bosnia, Macedonia, Argentina, Russia, and Lebanon. On the 29th, there's a closing panel on censorship and queer production. Films will also run throughout the conference on 27th and 28th of June. Our focus on artistic and cinematic production in conversation with our academic and activist activities is one way in which we think we'd like to distinguish ourselves. Film and art remain important mediums in Asia to challenge dominant ideas and representations of gender and sexuality, as well as of family, society, and culture. Art and film can confront and subvert discriminatory laws and attitudes, especially in contexts where LGBTQI issues remain marginalized. This diversity in representation sets us apart, creating networks that stretch beyond the traditional boundaries of academia, activism, film, and art. In conclusion, we have a lot of activities on, so please do peruse our online schedules at queerasia.com, or see the schedules at the registration desk during the reception, and hopefully some of you will have picked them up as well. But on a personal note, I'd like to thank our wonderful executive and general committees who work tirelessly in an entirely voluntary capacity, no less, to pull off these fabulous events. Daniel, Arpuv, Jack, Utsa, Alex and Priyank, Sarah, David, Ria, Richard and Zach. Our thanks in turn also go to the attendees this year, many of who have flown across the world to join us and take part in these activities. You are now part of the Queer Asia platform, and we are so excited to see and hear about your innovative and exciting research and interests. We are saddened, however, to mention that 5 lined-up attendees are unable to attend this year due to visa rejections, and additionally others due to financial restrictions. This situation makes us all the more aware of the very real ways that borders appear in our lives that cannot be crossed or manoeuvred, and the very real limitations that this imposes on our ability to collect, debate, and organise. So, with these questions in mind, I would like to turn over to our keynote panel, chaired by Dr. Noor Abu Asab, who will begin our discussions. Thank you for attending this event, and we hope you'll enjoy the evening and the rest of the conference and film festival. Please continue to support us by sharing our events in your networks and letting people know all about the fantastic events going on this year. And if you'd like to tweet, the hashtag is #QueerAsia2018. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's really great to be here, and as this is my second year participating in the Queer Asia Conference, I would like to say thank you very much for all of the effort that you put in organizing the conference and the festival, which run simultaneously and at the same time. It's amazing, and it's very much needed in London, in the UK, and within the global context of the global north as well. So thank you. And I think we'll go directly into the conversation because we have many exciting ideas that we'd like to discuss. And first, I would like to start by saying, as this conference revolves around bodies and border, it's really difficult to think of borders without thinking about nation states. Because within the context of Asia and within the context of the global south generally, we think of nation states often as post-colonial products, as entities that emerged following colonization, and that led in so many ways to the creation of fictitious borders that have torn apart families in some places, in many places actually. So having that in mind, I guess the first question I would like to throw at the panel is how do we conceptualize queer within borders and the nation-state framework in general? And can we consider, for example, revolutions, dissidents, and destabilizers of the system of the nation-state as queer per se? So,
Well, I think one of these folks should start because I'm going to go somewhere completely different.
I was going to do the same, so. Right, so nation state is not my favorite topic, but I guess I can start with something and then also definitely go somewhere different. I suppose this is how our anxiety about nation state shows in the first place. But I think one way to look into the bodily borderlessness, which is I think where I would like to start this conversation from, is to flip this premise and account for these, what I call bodies that border, that line. That is, those bodily and subjectivity formations that are thought borderline to some ostensibly more established way of collective being in the world, such as the bodies that transgress the boundaries of male and female. And sometimes these insurrectionary bodies, I would suggest, quite literally form a line, such as, to give you an illustration from my research, a row in the mosque that the Middle Ages Medinan gender variant subjectivity is locally known as Khodam, but often simplistically described as eunuchs in Western sources, famously used to form in order to preserve their favorite preacher from being stoned with gravel by a group of hardliners. So this Saf al-Khodam, the row of Khodam, was in a way not dissimilar, I would say, from the row of insurrectionary bodies here, self-described as queer politically and otherwise, that recently formed the so-called hard picket line here at SOAS. These two were bodies that bordered that line in order to break away from usually much more powerful and harmful bodily policing practices. So with that, I would turn to the nation state. So the state as a kind of a border-conducive entity par excellence, right, is often countered by such subversive bodies, that border, that line. And even when state lines are not necessarily transgressed, but reworked from within. So think the politics of national workers' solidarity by gender variant Khwaja Sara in Pakistan, who fought on the streets along with the urban poor affected by a meteoric rise of the price of sugar, or that of gender transgressive Indonesian Varia, who often claim that their variant, their kevarian, is a distinct Nusantara-wide, or that is Indonesian archipelago-wide phenomenon. So a nation state recognized only to be subverted so as to be made livable, however, of course, imperfectly, by the bodies its majority has rejected or pushed aside. So that identitary borders of such a state can be, I guess, at least to an extent, interrupted internally.
So do we want to go to, do you want to?
Well, why I was sort of slightly anxious in answering that is that I was going to take it in very different directions in terms of thinking about borders in terms of, I think the nation state and the legal boundaries are definitely terribly important. I'm just thinking about example in Hong Kong in terms of people from overseas who have got legal recognition of their same-sex relationship. When they come to Hong Kong, then basically they are practically unrelated to each other. So there has been judicial review case on a same-sex couple who were in a civil partnership that lived in the UK, but when they applied for visas in Hong Kong, one of them got a job visa, the other person being denied a dependent visa. So for me, that the state and the legal differences in a world in which the sexual citizenship is very unequally distributed is actually really astonishing in terms of how when a couple travels across the border, their legal status can be completely different. And I think that is terribly important. But I sort of also wanted to broaden the discussion of the borders in many different ways, not only the physical and the geographical, but also the social dimension of borders as well, and also the psychological and mental, in terms of well-being and also belonging or not as well. So one can only imagine that I think from a lot of the discussions that will come up in these coming few days about experiences of people crossing borders, when one goes into a new locale, although that border seems to have been crossed, but lots of intra-community, intra-societal borders that can be set up as well in terms of whether people feel belonging, whether people, lots of research showing that whether, say, migrants will feel that there are certain parts of the city that I don't belong to, or there are certain timings of the day that I don't feel able to use the community space, or am I part of the community or not? So I also feel that the borders in terms of these different kinds of social belonging or community sense is also very important. And also sort of also want to challenge us to think about there can also be borders in some instances that we don't imagine them in terms of, say, families can also be borders as well. So in that sense, that borders can also be there when people think that you should feel so relaxed when you go back to the family. But I guess in the Asian cultural context, one can think a lot about a lot of instances in which that family may not be the place where people feel belonging, but lots of family biopolitics in place. So the very family home or that door at the family can actually be a border, let alone there are also other institutions like education or other institutions where belonging should be felt that are not there. So that's why I sort of was originally hesitant in answering the question, because I wanted to take it to sort of that direction. And yeah.
So I'm going to go somewhere completely different, but play off the three sort of comments so far. And I want to actually start with, I'll tell you how I got going with this, was actually beginning to think about the history of science shifts when the idea of the border, a uniform culture, a uniform sense of being, actually became biological habit, which is the emergence of bacterial culture in the petri dish. So what I wanted to do, I wanted to do something that I call, which all of us are doing, practical theory, and I want to attend carefully to our everyday lexicon, where we're implicated in life, death, and control, border and boundary making, and sort of produce refugees in a biopolitical way. It's not typically where the conversation goes. I want us to think about everyday practices of extermination as queer ways of looking, or queer in the sense of turning to the ways in which we look just slightly askance to notice what's at stake. And in this case, it's microbial life. So commonplace habits where our genocidal practices are so naturalized, we just stop noticing them. But we also think that the only possibility for staying alive is through maiming or killing. And this is to refer to Despier's and Maya's work. And I just wanted to, from sort of thinking about Native Americans and Palestinian writers, to get us on the same page, to think about what it is, what are the practices or strategies of settler colonialism, projects of discrimination that separate us from them, dangerous from friendly, virulent from safe, useless from useful, terrorist from citizen, and there are many others. 2, purchase or buy into cleansing narratives and practices that ensure safety in life by exterminating or evacuating what's deemed dangerous. 3, devalue those who have another story or belittle these stories. And so let me explain. I'll just give a couple of examples from South Asia. I see my compatriots, friends, and relatives living in a paradox. A couple of scenes. Scene 1. We in South Asia, and in this case India, are like in many other regions in the midst and mired of projects of genocide in the ways in which they're commonly understood, in other words, the killing of communities. And are struggling to find forms to confront them, and I mean forms, right? In other words, whether we're dealing with a journalist murder in Kashmir, on top of militarization and everyday murder in the region, militarization in eastern India, cleansing of Rohingya refugees using the language of terrorism, the habitual lynching of Muslim men, children and women under the guise of car protection, Dalit communities in a constant, continuous barrage along a history of violence, universities under siege, I can go on and on. So, and what's interesting is, obviously, Modi is sharing tips with Erdogan. So, scene 2, while I was on a way to a village near where I live, and I was with some friends to talk to farmers to think about what's happening to the decimation of land. One person in the car asked if she could stop to buy antibacterial liquid to make sure that we could stay clean. Scene 3. I took one of my students to the hospital because she was sick. The nurse handed me an antibacterial wash. I refused. She smiled. She was from South India, from Kerala. We recognized each other. She said, I can't stop the doctors and the patients from using this thing. It kills, doesn't it? But the hospital is being given money to buy it. No one will listen to me. I tell them that it will kill them, but we use this thing, this antibacterial liquid, on everything. We are bacteria and viruses. No one really gets it, that if we kill all the bacteria, we'll all die. And then they give us probiotics. We buy pills filled with the good bacteria. Bacteria are refugees now, and new ones are invited to colonize us. We buy pills filled with them. I say this, and they laugh at me. She was a theorist of bodies and boundaries of control, of settler colonial impulses that have become quotidian. Bacterial wash is the new pear soap of the 21st century, the new cleansing agent, decimating the bad, but who decides? Body parts and the Indian middle class and upper middle class folk, and if you've been to places like Japan or Singapore, are all in the process of killing in such an ordinary way that even as we all fight the good fight against fascism, we're busy, in a fight that is about decimation. And I think it's worth thinking about our implication. And then I'll just stop with a couple more things I want to say. I've attended several conferences in India on the Anthropocene. Who is the anthropos in the Anthropocene? Saving the planet conversations were battered around, but no one wanted to talk about the bacteria. It felt too small, too dirty. But we are bacteria, aren't we? Viruses, fluids, electricity, chemicals, proteins, cells, all of which inhabit, argue, imagine, live. So bodies are not just bodies or boundaries.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That's really interesting. And very thought-provoking. I'm sure, yeah. I mean, I would really like you to elaborate on the idea of bodies being perceived as bacterial with the images. I mean, you brought to my head about antibacterial wash, etc. And I always think, I mean, one of the things that came to my mind when you were talking about that is the fact that in colonial writings, we often find colonialists describing the other they're intending to colonize as dirty, unclean, etc. So I would really appreciate some of your reflections on that as well.
And all of us can do it, actually. So I think so one of the things that's interesting, I mean, many of us have read or are aware of all the writing on the emergence of pear soap, right? And part of the project of making pear soap, like literally feel like it was the thing you had to use, was an entire lexicon of dirt. And so, I mean, the project of actually colonizing the colonized, literally, the project of colonization required the refiguration of dirt into cleanliness, right? So I think, I mean, and all of us the kinds of questions you raised, and I know your work, actually is about sort of looking at the question of how you literally push something out, exterminate something, using a kind of way of speaking, but we forget the literal forms of it, right? And partly I wanted to bring us back. I mean, a lot of my work is about thinking about the everydayness of political projects. So the project isn't just out there, there's an everydayness to it. And if you're looking at the long history of colonialism, the everydayness of the political project of cleansing dirt that becomes a part of how we think we ought to live best is, I think, in this century in relation to bacteria. So, and also refugees, terrorists, right?
Yeah.
It's a strangely familiar world that we're. It's a strangely familiar world that we're suddenly entering when we kind of focus on the microbiological and molecular life. And I think one of the phenomena of that life is borderlessness, the ways in which moleculae extend into one another, in ways in which a human body, I suppose, does not necessarily perceive immediately. So I actually had quite a few things to say about this. It's so interesting that we just ended up here. That was not planned. But here's what I wanted to say. It has to do with what you Gita said about, us and them, and then the concept in which the anthropos emerges yet only to kill off, yet only to deny particular forms of life. And it's not just coloniality, and I think all of us should have been here last year, right, when we were talking about decolonization, because I think all of our lives and all of our work in some ways is always about kind of how you kind of become dirty again, how do you become multiply again, how do you become infested, if you will, with the various bacteria that we in fact belong to in order to reclaim spaces that have been cleansed for us. So there's something I would say about, and please bear with me now, about human body that defies borders. Not only is one's body unthinkable outside of its immediate environment, be that environment construed out of bodies of others, of certain human, or even as we just heard, non-human shared corporeality, or of a space where the world or worlding happens. One's body is equally seemingly non-existent in the absence of other partial and perhaps necessarily imperfect connections in language, sociality, and other ways of being collective or part of collectives in one's life world. So to draw a border, as Madeline Stradern seems to have implied, as you might remember, with her critical anthropological concepts of individuality and partial connections, means in a way to slip into an epistemic abyss where in order to become something other than the other, one needs to at least partly lose oneself. But such radical collectivity of the human, abhorred as it was by Enlightenment and post-Enlightenment thoughts alike, has something of an ideality, perhaps even an aspirational queer futurity a la José Esteban Muñoz, precisely because it seeks to undo artificial borderlines of human personhood as it moves along towards an ever-distant utopia of togetherness that seeks no a priori categories of human relationships, but sort of a Benjaminian Spielraum, a place for experimentation in an otherwise, in an elsewhere. And as Muñoz wrote in Cruising Utopia so beautifully, he said queerness then might be described as that thing that let us feel that this world is not enough, that indeed something is missing. But I think nonetheless that, of course, a cautionary tale here is in order. Before thinking bodies as anything anywhere, one might need to account for the harm the all-encompassing episteme, such as that of LGBTI, or for that matter of an uncritically deployed we, are causing to the life worlds of those systemically left outside of the power structures of late capitalist universalities. So this tale, this critique, of course, has been and will still be, of course, told many times and in many tongues, including those of sexually diverse and gender variant communities and subjectivities across Asia. And there and then, queer as a term claimed and reclaimed over and over again, localized, regionalized, globalized, and then again reworked to simultaneously fit often incommensurable scales, would sometimes be singled out by some as hopeful, and often so in this Muñozian sense of a utopian futurity, an ideality beyond mere identity politics. And yet others would find queer as unable to encapsulate numerous idiosyncratic forms of sexual and gendered life, and let alone the oft-violent intersections of class and caste, and race, spirituality, and so on. So consider, for example, the famous 5 genders of Muslim Bugis in South Sulawesi, or the impossibility of the Pakistani gender variant Khwaja to be fully subsumed under the trans episteme, given that their bodily experience of the self is inclusive not only of their sexually and gender transgressive experience, but their particular spiritual, kinship, linguistic, and other ties too. So queerness, at the very least, I think, cannot be presumed a priori. Its futures are partial still. I certainly could not deploy it freely personally in the field in Pakistan, Indonesia, or elsewhere, onto the bodies of those who themselves would not subscribe to its ambiguous allure. So human bodies, even if seen as sui generis borderless, or as the sites of constant becoming, are being conditioned into border itself on a daily basis. And this everyday violence of the border can seemingly be countered only in communion with other like-minded humans. So recall, for example, that Judith Butler argued for a touch, and a form of yielding that establishes a relationship to a you, that is to a pronoun that is open-ended precisely on the question of gender, in her search for an insurrectionary human beyond epistemic and other premeditated borders. So she wrote, and I will quote her very briefly, "If there is a relationship between this you, whom I seek to know, whose gender cannot be determined, whose nationality cannot be presumed, and who compels me to relinquish violence, then this mode of address articulates a wish, not just for a non-violent future for the human, but for a new conception of the human, where some manner of touch, other than violence, is the precondition of the making." So Butler's presumptive you, then, is a you still untamed by gender roles and other forms of violence, the you whose ways of being in the world invite me to explore the act of touch as an expression of infinite possibilities. There is, of course, more than a hint of this Muñozian futurity here, but also an awareness that such attention to exploratory touch needn't be given an a priori queer moniker.
I want to actually play around the idea of the dirtiness and the kind of control by bringing in something very different in terms of sexuality, desire that crosses the border. And sort of a lot of that then comes into what we can think about, say, not only in terms of LGBTI lives, but also women's lives that migrate, that usually when these different bodies migrate across the border, sometimes the desire and sexuality becomes something that's usually filled with a lot of different imaginations, usually in terms of seduction, in terms of something to be contained. And I find that's very interesting. When these bodies cross across the border, I sort of think about there's both the dilemma that the bodies become no body, but the body's embodiment also becomes over-highlighted as well. I want to use some examples to illustrate that in terms of, say, one example is in terms of gay Asian men overseas as well. That's an example that if you see different stereotypes that are associated with racism, sexuality, then Asian gay men's bodies basically are seen as sexless. That's usually associated with black men being hypersexed and then Asian men being, well, you only think about family, you only think about work, you only think about education. You have no sex and sexuality in your life. But on the other hand, it's also very interesting that usually sometimes these racial stereotypes also then associate with certain types of seduction. The seduction of the golden boy from the Far East that brings with a certain type of mysteriousness. So I find that very interesting in terms of how when sexuality and desire, when these bodies cross across the border, it's also similarly, there's that sense of like, well, that's the excess. It needs to be contained, it needs to be controlled. And then I also think about the situation of foreign domestic helpers' sexuality in Hong Kong. It may surprise you that in a population of 7 million people in Hong Kong, any guess about how many foreign domestic helpers are there in Hong Kong? Any guess? Well, shall we do a little vote of like within a population of 7 million, is it 100,000, 200,000, 300,000 foreign domestic helpers in Hong Kong? First one, 100,000. More, 200,000. It's like a bidding. It's like homes under the hammer or something. 200,000. Yeah. 200,000. 300,000. Well, 360,000 is the latest figure. But in terms of their sexuality, in a recent research that I did with foreign domestic helpers in Hong Kong, loss of control of their sexuality, also based on this idea of seduction as well, sort of like, would the foreign domestic helper take away or destroy my family? or very similar discourse about mainland immigrants into Hong Kong as well. Lots of sort of portraying migrant sexuality as in excess and it's something to be controlled, which is definitely unfair description and stereotypes as well. So if you, actually just a few days ago, I happened to pass by an agent of foreign domestic helpers. If you're in Hong Kong, that's fascinating. In terms of the image that they put on the photo, a very standard posture in terms of the gender expression as well, which also echoes to what my lesbian foreign domestic helpers experience is, saying that they also very carefully monitor their gender expression. Otherwise, their bodies would be seen as not good enough in the family, whether they would teach the next generation a wrong image. So I feel that sort of also resonates to that kind of like dirt and containment, which bodies are contagious to others as well.
Yeah, I think I want to go back. I mean, one of the really interesting things to think about is the way in which the language of like out of control, loss of control, bacteria or viruses out of control, like literally, and the way in which, you know, sort of when you think about all the stuff on viral multiplication, right? It's actually all about excess, right? It sort of multiplies, inhabits your body. So in some really weird way, a virus is a domestic helper, right? So, I mean, that's why I wanted to go back to the sort of beginning of this sort of, when we started actually really using a language of the idea of a uniform subject. So, I mean, I think, you know, it's, and what's interesting is to think, I mean, when I was trafficking through the border, transiting through Hong Kong, right, they checked me out for sickness, right? They took my temperature. I mean, I was a bacterial subject, right? And I was fortunate that I didn't display the proper signs of bacteriality, right? I didn't have, I tend to be low temperature. They didn't realize that 98 is my version of a fever. So the idea of the, like literally, you have to be a proper bacteria, right? And because I was in fact an improper bacteria, I got read as a proper bacteria and was allowed to actually catch my plane to go on to Taiwan. So, where my temperature was checked again. So I think, you know, it's really interesting. I mean, once you think through this notion of the everydayness of a kind of materialization, and I would disagree with Jose, who was a really good friend and much adored by me. This isn't about ideality, right? It's about materializing the circumstances of virulence, right? And, you know, and I think it's interesting to think about the question of touch, right? Because actually, you cannot be touched. So when I was in Hong Kong, and when I got off the plane in Taiwan, we have a friend, Stacey McKee, who's an amazing performance artist, who's going to be doing stuff at the Welcome with gloves. And it's literally, there were gloves, right? So, I mean, it's interesting to think about touch, but actually touch is precisely what the idea of bacteriality does not permit. And that's exactly, which is what you're saying. So I wanted to think, okay, so what does it mean to reanimate the idea of touch? And I think, I'm not sure, I mean, and to reanimate the questions you guys raised, which is not to think, so one of the things that happens a lot is we slip into the us and them, right? And so when we think human, we think, I mean, the moment so how do you, and it's a question that I think you asked us to in some ways, sort of pushed us, gave us an impulse to reimagine, which is our language already gets us caught in expectations of settler colonialism. We are all our own settler colonialists, right? So how do we speak in ways that don't necessarily come from the US? And I have this whole thing on capital, which I at some point maybe, if we have time, I'll think about. You know, and I think that having all of us on the podium might allow us to actually begin to decolonize our forms of speaking. And it's literally, that's why you wrote, that's why all of us wrote, you know, because each little word brings us back to an everyday habit of genocide, right? You know, throwing genocide again into your midst.
Yeah.
So,
I wonder what Noor has to say about this, whether this is the direction that you are.
No, this is great. This is perfect, actually. And I would really like to go back to what you started with, Tung, actually, on especially with Gita talking about us, our minds being colonized, us being our own settler colonizers. And I would like to go back to your conceptualization of borders as not just the nation states borders, but they're also the borders from within.
mm-hmm.
And would really like to hear more about your thoughts on that.
Yeah, do you want to start?
I mean, I guess because my background being sociologist, I sort of always think about this interrelationships between both the society and the individual, and then how it all plays out. And I guess, say, especially when I was going that direction, then I think about borders as both something out there and in us as well, and then this can also be interrelated as well. And then also sometimes think about, say, even just my experience of coming here as well, of something, the kind of, as someone from Hong Kong was obviously a place where was colonized by the UK, and then I sort of also think about in a way that how do I deal with my own internalized racism of even thinking about whether I can be a keynote speaker in a way as well. That I think there are lots of all these internal borders that we think about, well, as a Chinese working class man, growing up, can I go to the UK to lead a discussion? Am I wealthy enough or not? I think these borders, I think these are also very interesting moments for us to think about, exactly as Gita talked about, these everyday practices as well of actually that's something that surprised me as well when I reflected on that experience. And I think, although that's a personal experience, but I think that speaks also to a whole body literature of internalization of racism, internalization of homophobia. How do we deal with both these structures are not only out there, but then these borders are also within us as well. So I guess that's why I was both very keen on thinking about borders in these different ways, because these different borders also have very influential consequences in our lives as well, in terms of different potentialities, whether we can realize different agentic power that different minoritized groups have or not. And I think that sort of brings in also interdisciplinary dialogues as well, in terms of psychology, legal, how all these work together in terms of these different borders, and how people have resilience also in overcoming the barriers. So I guess that's where I was trying to sort of think with in that sense. Yeah.
So this is to me quite a perfect moment to reflect the very fact that we're sitting right now, right here in this space, which is called SOAS, which facelifted itself at the School of Oriental and African Studies into something that is not quite sure what it is. And this is exactly the key moment in which one can actually realize how this happens, how over and over and over again the structures that actually need being materialized get hidden again, get hidden into these structures that we are sitting in and participating willingly in this experiment right over and over again. And we will go wherever the home is again. and then do it to the others. And so I want to address, in that sense, the elephant in the room in a way, which is not necessarily just coloniality of our general theory, but the, generally speaking, queer theory that has traveled, as you know, from the West to the West. And in so doing, I think, perpetuated the logics and epistemic violence of all other etiologically global modern conceptual regimes. So along the way, however, as this very event, I suppose, shows, it has been pluralized, transformed, made multi-directional, linked to numerous, in fact, insurrectionary practices, right? And yet, even at its most experimental, it has been difficult for queer theory to contemplate an external to itself. That is, an outside to its core areas and categories, most importantly, of study. And as such, it has been of necessity the victim of its own paradigm, whereby on the one extreme end, everything and everywhere and everyone has the potential to be queered or recognized as queer, while on the other extreme end, what one really, talks about are still the same old identity politics. So of course there's much potentially hopeful experimental gray area, gray space in between these extremes. But an external to the dyad of queer, non-queer could be even more productive. That's actually what I want to suggest. I have argued in a similar way, and if I can just bother you with a bit of my research, for illegality as an external to the logics of law and its illegal paradigm, as a potentially emancipatory space in which a law subject, whether individual or collective, resists law's epistemic and literal violence by the sheer force of that subject's otherness or outsideness or illegibility with respect to the legal regulation that is enabled by the legal distinction. So it means, in a way, making oneself external to the degree possible to law. So could, and if so, should other than queer and non-queer subjectivities become the subject of queer theory proper? Where would such externality to its own logics lead queer theory next? So insurrectionary selfhoods, historical and contemporary, across Asia and beyond, do not neatly fit the monikers of personhood queer theory has chiefly worked with and theorized to date. So in this sense, such selfhoods remain vernacular. But at the same time, they are so queerly good to think with across and beyond the borders of disciplinary, as you said, thought. So for example, the 5 genders of the Bugis of South Sulawesi, the male, female, Chalbai, Chalai, and Bisu, are as important for one's understanding of Muslim pluralities of the South as any more so-called central or numerous Muslim community. So there are connections, however partial, across borders, of course. Persons could spill over and intersect humanities and ideology precisely because its borderlines bodies never quite fully become nor know themselves. But I agree that there's a particularly material turn here to be resuscitated. There's a particularly kind of consciousness of the space that has to be, revoked over and over again in our own work. And that comes through epistemologies, through the language, through the bodies that move in spaces, us as researchers, and our own kind of reflexive turns in anthropology and elsewhere. But it's not sufficient. It's not sufficient because there's the system in which we abide by, which we perpetuate. And so I think what we have to start with is the potentiality of a personhood that spills over and intersects beyond the epistemes that we normally use to address it.
I'm going to talk with things that both of you said, because I just wrote this, I hate referring to my own work, but I just wrote an article on the word vernacular. And I think we need to start there. It's got a very particular colonial history. It started in relation to the lineage of botany into Linnaeus. It was about translating specific texts to travel from various parts of Asia, from Farsi to Japanese, to Sanskrit, to Hindustani, to Arabic, to literally revive the moribund literatures of Europe. And out of that came British and German Romanticism, right? So vernacular, and so what happens a lot, and I want to think with what Tong said, which is the question of capital or currency, right? There's also stuff on aid, we won't talk about that for the moment. So, and what you said, which is kind of interesting, Vanja, which is how much, literally, we've been trained, again, this is an everyday habit, and it's a global habit, in thinking about the US as reserve currency, right? So bear with me for a moment, right? So a theory that comes from the US becomes necessary to the way in which we analyze or talk or think or refer, right? And I'm thinking about the work of a bunch of young scholars in Cambridge who are putting together a collection to actually think about other texts that would come from the Middle East and South Asia, right, as a way of undoing it. And I think, I mean, what's interesting is it's where we imagine we get credit. So in some ways, the US holds all of our credit capital, right? And everything else is vernacular, right? And while we've already forgotten this colonial history of vernacular, which is about extraction, right? So I think, I mean, it'd be really interesting to do something really odd, which I think people have been doing, and I look at the work of somebody who's since passed away, Randy Martin, who actually thought about financialization and what happened financially in Asia, which is there's a shift in Asia among negotiations happening in Asia, and I don't necessarily agree with the forms of governance, but there's a shift and Asian governments are actually asking Asian governments not to pay their credit or their debt in dollars, right? And that's going to be a huge global shift, because suddenly people will be dumping US bonds. What would it mean to take that as our queer practice? Like literally dump the dollar. Dump I mean, not that so I'm not saying we don't traffic, right? The poet I wrote on translated things from the UK, translated poets from the US. So I'm not arguing in the usual sort of indigenous only fashion, right? Because indigenousness itself is part of a global conversation. What I'm saying is, what would happen which is what we're raising, if we reoriented the notion of capital and credit in the academy itself, and I think you guys are trying to do it through Queer Asia, to not always come from that, right? To actually say, okay, I mean, I might not like the Chinese government, but they are letting, they might be involved in all sorts of very complicated projects in Sri Lanka and in Ethiopia, but they're asking people, they're saying, pay in rupees, right? What would it mean to have a queer inter-Asia conversation? I mean, this is why I was actually thinking of this nurse whose name was Rosie as my theorist, right? Because that's what we don't do. We don't actually allow people on the ground to be our theorists. So, I mean, I don't know what you think of that, Noor.
No, I totally agree. I mean, one of the reasons why I'm not an institutionalized academic, in a way. I think what comes to my mind at the moment actually is with thinking about ourselves as queer bacteria, is how important the anti-border struggle to the queer struggle itself, whether that is anti-borders in the traditional sense, or whether that is cultural imperialism or colonized minds in a way. And I think us being here is very important always to counter the dominant non-queer narrative that exists and that emerges. And I think it's time now to move open to the audience for questions and answers.
Yeah, we've thrown a whole lot at you. Everything from the nomenclature of Linnaean genders and sexualities to
bacteria, to biology,
to domestics.
Yes.
Comments?
Comments,
You
questions?
can say, oh my God, fuck all, I don't want to be a bacteria.
That very exhilarating conversation. I was really particularly intrigued by the idea of microbiology, and I was thinking about reproduction and the way we understand time in relation to reproduction. And if you want to tease out temporality based on microbial reproduction, could that lead to a different way of understanding history of desire in relation to bodily borders? I'm just throwing it out there.
So I think we'll take 3 questions and answers, and then 3 questions and answers.
More people can answer from the floor.
Yeah.
I mean, you guys can answer each other.
All right. I'll ask my question first, if that's okay. Thanks everyone for your really inspiring thoughts. Nora, you started with the question whether revolution is per se queer. So I actually wondered, since you asked that question, what your own thoughts are on that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Hi, so my question is whether internalized racism and internalized homophobia stigmatizes how we see queer bodies, like within the Asian communities.
Okay. So we'll start with an answer to the question of reproduction.
Not the revolution.
Yes.
But reproduction could be the revolution.
Yes.
Exactly.
Yeah, I think maybe I'll throw an idea out there. I think when I think about reproduction, and particularly within the context of borders, and again, I always return back to the nation state because I feel, and that's my own personal view on it, I feel it's the ultimate colonial product of the world as we know it. So as the ultimate colonial product, the project of the nation state relies heavily on reproduction. It relies heavily on the reproduction of collectivities, whether that is biological reproduction through the use of female bodies, or that is the reproduction of national and ethnic narratives. So now moving to Greta's question on how I think of revolutions, I think that when I think about queerness, I think about queerness as a state of disturbing the mainstream, a state of disturbing dominance. And this is why definitely I would consider migrants, immigrants, revolutionaries, destabilizers of dominance as queer in that sense.
So, I mean, I would agree with you because reproduction is at the heart of capital, right? It's about biopolitics in its deepest sense. I mean, if you go back to Foucault and the idea of population itself, right?
Exactly.
It's that the heart of it is to think about the question of reproducibility, but I think you are asking us something else. And there's a kind of, there are sort of interesting temporalities that are kind of configured in the projects of reproducibility, right? Which include the temporality, if you're talking about biopolitics, it's the temporality of illness, of disease, it's, you know, all of those things. But you're asking for something else, I think, that's the sense I get, which is that what if, I mean, because at the heart of some of these, the sort of biopolitical, is the notion of the reproduction of bacteria and viruses, right? And what if we didn't think reproduction at all, right? Because that's what I think viruses do. They make us not, like, screw up our sense of what it means to produce another to be productive, right? And I mean, if you look at Cohen's work, or even if you're looking at, to talk about Euro-Americans, I mean, it's interesting to look at Derrida. The French guys love their science, right? It's insinuated into every third sentence somewhere or another. And, you know, he asked about the idea of the host, right? And so literally when you're thinking about reproduction, you have the idea of the host nation. What if we let go of that, right? Would we actually be able to really rethink the temporality of the biopolitical, which for Foucault certainly was mired in the notion of capital, right? Although he rarely speaks of what's really important. And of war. I mean, I'm asking, the references I have is to the idea of a state of war, right? What if we let go of that? What would it look like? And I think both of you were trying to get us to think that, I think. And, you know, I don't know, I was thinking this sort of, to really think, like actually I was thinking of Mesna Kato's work on fugitiveness, right? And actually, there's somebody else, Mahavish Ahmed, who's actually writing on the idea of the musafir, the safar, the journey, and thinking, and they were having this conversation actually last week in Cambridge, and we're trying to think about what it means to be fugitive in your own place, right? To live as a fugitive, and that gets us back to bacterial life, but also the question of what it means to be, to ask, you know, to think about Palestine, to think about Balochistan, to think about Kashmir, you know. And I think, I mean, that's the project, I mean, in some ways, the project of internalized racism and internalized homophobia is exactly that project. I mean, that's why I wanted us, because what we do, I mean, having done years and years and years of workshops with women against racism, as part of the work I did in the US, you know, one of the things that's really interesting is that it becomes exceptional, right? So what happens, and I wanted to think about the ways in which we do this work, right, on the outside, but actually don't do this work in our everyday life, right? So how do you, when we think about capital, we're dealing with it outside, but what does it mean to, like all of you know, to fight for a pension, which is an everyday process of a fiscal life, right? So just to, you know, and how in even arguing for a pension, the idea of charity and poverty and internalized class hatred is actually has been institutionalized, right? And you know, gender violence.
So if I can continue with that, it is quite a it's quite a provocation not to go to the typical ways in which, you know, we all slip into, of course, because that's how we're schooled, and now, for instance, talk about, you know, revolutionary violence, because what I have a problem with when it comes to revolutions, which is why I really loved your response, is precisely that it kind of re-invokes these injurious masculinities over and over again that will then fight on behalf of everybody else and win this revolution. And we know that the kind of, and the, you know, the Fanon, Sartre, Arendt, Butler sort of trajectory when it comes to it. I'm not going to definitely reiterate it here. What I wanted to talk about a little bit more is the reproduction, but kind of reproduction that is stilted in a colonial project again. So I'm working currently on the 18th century and gender variant oral historians who were disappeared very forcefully from the archive, the colonial archive, or in such an incredibly systematic way that one actually can follow it in the archive. So there's a violence of archive that insists on history writing instead of history speaking or history performing or history, you know, being and living. And there are ways in which I think one can be a revolutionary, if it's not so strong a word, in kind of reimagining, re-evoking these particular types of reproduction of knowledge that have been very obviously intervened in by the colonial power. And so there's so much work to be done. It hasn't been done almost at all. One feels that, you know, after post-colonial theory has landed, that we suddenly, you know, have had a space, but my God, we haven't. We're still to fight across these disciplines of ours for that space over and over and over again. So in that sense, I think there's something rather insurrectionary and beautiful about, again, this space, just to turn it upside down, and this crowd here and all of our wonderful colleagues and students, precisely because we can, in fact, we do have some epistemic and other forms of power, of course, right? And that power perhaps does not feel apparent when you're a student, but that surely, can shine through in certain moments, in certain situations. So I want to, remember again that we did here have, the hard picket line that actually claimed itself as a queer space, okay? And being punished by this institution for it. So there are ways to resist and be revolutionary that are everyday and that are extremely important, and that don't not necessarily, revoke this awful injurious masculinity that is associated with open war.
I mean, I'm just thinking in particular about revolution and queerness, and thinking about my experiences of both working on LGBTI equality and also observing the massive changes in the past decade about, that constant struggle with the idea of homonormativity that Lisa Duggins brings up. But that kind of tension is so, I guess I find it particularly much more difficult being both an academic and also someone working very closely with NGOs and other people on the ground, because on one hand, I find that it's much easier for me to provide the critique, but at the same time of the very on-the-ground struggles of that. And I find that with LGBTI equality, given that things have been moving at quite a pace, I find that kind of struggle really sort of very easily observable and very very difficult to reconcile. And just also thinking about, say, issues about how multinational corporations also get very involved in LGBTI equality in Hong Kong, where I operate, that as an academic, I sometimes find it absolutely unexpected that, say, multinational corporations say that I want to know more about your work on diversity and inclusion. In fact, actually, I think there's a panel on the second or third day on business inclusion as well. I think that sort of constant struggle, because in my previous years of engagement, I guess my own position also changed a lot. Coming from a sociological background, I was very, very resistant in thinking about even working with multinational corporations. I was both resistant, and it was also very much an unknown world to trespass into that I was thinking about. But later on, more and more, I also think about Anthony Giddens of structuration as well, that no one structure is actually as rigid as what we imagine. Actually, any structure is also made up of individual actions that's repeated over time. That's through process of structuration, it becomes a structure. That made me think a lot about observing the internal efficacy within those business organizations as well. That made me think about there's no one organization or no one sector that is necessarily evil that I should definitely not work with. And also one thing that I also ask myself or reply to colleagues who say, why do you work with the business sector, is also I ask them whether racism, sexism, and sexual harassment, I think you would also agree with me that they are also there in academia as well. There's no one sector that is this necessarily sacred sector. There's also not the business sector. There's only this monolithic machine. So I guess that kind of revolution, strive for equality. How do we work across sectors? I'm obviously not putting it very clearly, but I guess those are the kind of struggles that especially working with activists on. I guess those are the conversations that never end. Yeah.
I just want to respond to think about the question of revolution in relation to what both my co-panelists said and in relation to what Noor raised. And I think what's interesting is that revolution, it's very easy to become messianic in a revolution, right? to actually imagine that you're the only flag bearer. And this is what you're raising, and this is what you raised, and I think this is what you were talking about, Tung, is that in the process we instantiate an us and a them, right? And I mean, I'm not saying corporations are great. I'm dealing with the Thai subsidiary of Monsanto, but the us and the them doesn't get us out of how to think everyday transformations. I mean, that's why I was thinking of Mesna Kato's sort of work on fugitive, right? To actually, also just how do you do it, right? How do you, and I think that's what in some ways you wanted to animate, is how do you do everyday politics in a way that is about something shifting askance without calling something a revolution because of the Christian language that comes with, however left it is, however, whatever, space it comes from, right? That comes with the idea of, with the notion of revolution. Now we might be able to go a different way, but I just want to attend to that. I mean, that's sort of queer attentiveness, right?
Thank you so much for this. You talked about language and the importance of the use of language. It made me think about victimhood and the relationship between victimhood, because the use of language can affect the discourse around victimhood, who gets to be a victim and who doesn't get to be a victim. Can you please tell me more about what are your thoughts about that? Especially for women or queer bodies or migrants or people of color.
I want to ask about the issue of foreign domestic helpers in Hong Kong, because you talked about how they were perceived as contamination. I was wondering about the path of contamination, who are likely to be contaminated and who are immune from it. So if it's the wife who is afraid of her husband being contaminated, being taken away by the female domestic helper, it sounds like the way we make sense of transgressive bodies or bodies transgressing national boundaries is operating on the idea of heteronormativity, as if heterosexuality is borderless. And I was wondering what are your views on that?
So mine is just like a comment. I think, so we started the discussion with the nation state and the borders and the queerness. So I think like when we talk about the borders, when we always bear in mind the self and the other, and automatically we also bear in mind the privileges that come with being the self and the other. And I also wanted to reflect on the idea of this intersectionality of class and racism. So what I was having in mind while coming here at this conference was that, am I queer enough? Like, so we were talking about the excessivity of the queerness, but my thoughts were more like, am I queer enough that I have enough money to declare for my visa to the UK, that I could afford the plane tickets to get here from Kazakhstan, and whereas my queer comrades or whatever were struggling with the court proceedings at the same time. So I think when we talk about the borders and the nation state, I think always comes the other part is not also the being enough queer, and who gets to define who is queer. Is it there is always this intersectionality between capital, like the class, the gender, am I also disability, like I'm an able-bodied cisgender woman, am I queer enough in this sense?
Okay, so will any of the panelists want one more, and this will be actually our last question, I'm sorry.
Well, we can continue to.
Yes.
I'll be very quick in that case. Thank you very much. I really enjoyed this evening. I'm going to start with a comment and then move on to a question very quickly. just to end with a slight criticism of the phrase. A lot of gay men my age, and perhaps older, will have winced at the phrase queer bacteria. We might live in a post-AIDS world, but we don't. Too many of my friends are HIV positive. And they'd wince at the flippancy of the use of that term. And yet, I remember watching a film, 120 BPM, which was out recently, rather silly French film with a lot of cute guys with amazing cheekbones who didn't reflect anything that actually happened during that age. But I went back to read the literature of the 80s and the early 90s. Edwin White, Adam Morris-Jones, Larry Kramer, etc., etc. And they talked about this queer bacteria as being liberating, as being somehow actually, it set them free from something. So I'm wondering if there's something from that, apart from my wincing at that, but is there something analogous with what you're talking about today in terms of queer theory, or what they were talking about perhaps back in the late 80s?
I'd like to start because I was one of the people in the late 80s who did work on prisons, HIV/AIDS. And I am not being flippant about bacteria. I'm being very deliberate about bacteria. And it's specifically also because I've been working on HIV/AIDS in South Asia, right? But watching something happen, and to me it's incredibly urgent and terrifying. And the urgency is, and it's actually Safia, who's one of this group of Middle Eastern and South Asian women, who's sort of retooling where we get our texts from, was asked me a question, which is, we're living in a world that's ending, right? How do we actually address it? How do we live in it? How do we think it? And you know, as somebody, I mean, literally sort of as somebody who started out as a scientist and was trained in bacteriology, among other things, I began to see the way in which the language of bacteria, and if you look at Ed Cohen's work, it's very productive, I think. That, you know, and as somebody who's positive and somebody who's had autoimmune, and I do that quite deliberately because the idea of autoimmune is necessary to the project of queerness, right? So what I wanted to do, and I think there was a reason that people were actually beginning to ask that question in the 1980s around queer bacteria, because they understood that actually they were engaged in a project of cleansing. And let me tell you, when you go to a prison, you show people needles for needle exchange, and they count every single needle when it comes out. You know that what you've been asked by, at the time, very radical New York City government to do is tell people that they are part of the project of racialized genocide, right? So for me, I mean, those urgencies are very kind of necessary, and those urgencies are every day. And I think, I mean, I was just thinking about that question of language. I'll say that is really to think about I was thinking about who is contaminated, right? The direction of contamination, and that was part of what we were talking about in the 1980s. It's part of the idea of the vector itself, which is a direction of contamination. And so I think this is something we should continue to talk about. And I think, so I'll say one more and then stop, which is in the question of language. And one of the things I make all my students do, if they want to use the word normative at all, is read the entire history of statistics. Because it is a biopolitical word. It's a mathematical word, and it's engaged. And so Foucault used it that way. We now turn it into a descriptive word, right? What's at stake in people who are involved in queer projects, and we say we don't orient our way of imagining ourselves to the West, right? To actually not ask a question, and people have. I'm not the first person saying this. Is really good work in medieval studies, right? Asking the question about what it means to make normative our frame word, right? And how then does it actually capture us in the project of the idea of the population itself, which is both statistical and fiscal. So.
let me talk about border and class and racism just a little bit from the perspective that I perhaps know the best, which is the perspective of Pakistan's contemporary realities and its sexual and gender diversity. There's literally a canal that one needs to cross in Lahore in order to come from, urban city slums to a space where actually queer politics may or may not take place. And I'm not talking about this to demonize these queer politics, not at all, because these queer politics that happen on the better side, in amongst the people who speak a particular language or a particular set of languages, are actually wonderfully complex in themselves and want to be very critical about the space. But what I have, experienced in the field is people literally saying we cannot cross this canal because the language changes. These daily urgencies of which you spoke so beautifully change instantaneously. They live at the other side. And how to cross this means really to think very hard and very seriously about whether or not you're committing now yet another colonial violence or you're doing something actually quite else. And that something else might be, so on one side we have what you mentioned, right, this really working with evil. I mean, when one, works with particular, new capitalist industries, and one works, including, by the way, HIV/AIDS industry in Pakistan and so on, which has become quite a problematic thing in its own right. But I mean, when one works with contemporary amalgamations of biopolitics that want to conquer a certain space and really mess it up, one works with evil, one has to acknowledge it. At the same time, one also experiences this when there is a border, when there is a canal, and when people think in solidarity with one another as to how to cross this border meaningfully, how to cross this canal meaningfully, then wonderful humanness kind of shines through as well. So there are these stories to be told as well. And these stories are often, I think, captured in us rethinking the concept of language, or kind of rethinking the question of language, which is everything, which is, I come from Bosnia and Herzegovina that has experienced precisely the politics that have been, played with since 1850s onwards. In Punjab and in Bosnia, you can just look at them right next to one another and see how language actually becomes the key, one of the key terms of art, right, in which one experiences the colonial and other forms of, of nationalist, mostly, politics and intrusion. And so that language then, attention to that language is like a really attention to a litmus paper, because it provides you with so many ways of understanding things in a new light, right? So, and people do it. People do it on a daily basis, and people come up with new terms of art. People come up with ways in which they will express themselves that will not be as injurious as we are used to be, when it comes to language politics normally. So I would end there. It has to do it has to do with class, but that class also comes from a particular place, right? And that place also then brings us back to coloniality.
And I've got two points I want to respond to. I think the first one is on victimhood. I think there's both the issue on both minoritized groups named as victims. I think that is a very obvious problem. But at the same time, I think sometimes I also working with LGBT groups. I think sort of active resistance, very, very clear resistance to say I'm not a victim, sometimes can also bring secondary pressure or even trauma in that sense. Because I just bring my example of trying to recruit people into a project on LGBTI people's experiences of discrimination in Hong Kong. It was surprisingly difficult to recruit people, not because people have not experienced discrimination, but that people have routinized discrimination to the extent that, well, no one has exactly come to me and hit me in my face. I'm still surviving. I'm not a victim, which I think is a very interesting dilemma. It's one thing to say that, well, people should not be given the label of being a victim. People should not be victimized. But it's also the other sort of that constant, almost we are in, everything is getting better. No one is having any issue to do with depression. Everyone is bright and beautiful, which we obviously see that's not the case for a lot of gender and sexual minorities, especially if we see staggering figures about mental health as well. So I find sort of that victimhood in terms of both being careful to not labeling others as victims, but also not creating that community or societal pressure that no one feels able to actually claim negative experiences. I think both are equally important. And I sometimes also worry whether in the fight for LGBT equality, sometimes the latter actually puts more pressure on people saying that no, everything is fine, everything is rosy, which does not match lived reality. And the other one about foreign domestic helpers' experiences, Personally, I find that is something that, although specifically to the case of foreign domestic helpers, but I think it speaks to more other examples, is that I think that kind of fear of others usually tells us about uncertainty or anxiety about ourselves. I think in the case of foreign domestic helpers, it's actually that uncertainty or anxiety about womanhood of Hong Kong women in a situation of rising educational level, but at the same time of lesser time that can be put in the foreign domestic space, then that anxiety about relationship with my husband, relationship with my children, who actually seem to be even closer to the foreign domestic helper and sharing with them their emotional issues rather than sharing with me as a mom. And I find that, although that speaks to the case of foreign domestic helpers, but I think that speaks to the larger point of to the case of bodies and borders, that usually sort of erecting these borders or naming others as others usually also tells us about the anxiety or the mess that we're having internally within our border, whatever that is. In a sense. So I find it quite interesting, although it's about foreign domestic helpers, but I feel that has got larger resonance with how us and them obviously has to do with what we are dealing with ourselves internally as well. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I mean, we're running out of time actually, and this is never boring. It can go on forever. And we'd be happy to continue the conversation afterwards. And I would like to really thank the panelists who made it today for disturbing the dominance today, in particular in this space. So thank you very much, and thank you all for coming.
Yeah, I think all of us would like to get everybody who worked or was involved with the conference, including Jack, please stand up. So we can actually thank all of you for doing all the work.
Yeah.
Please. I mean, it's really amazing that you put this together and got us all here and did a huge amount of work. So, and thank you all. And we can actually think about the question of victims and claims and continue to do that. But let's claim pleasure for a moment.
So, thank you very much for that really exciting discussion. You've already sowed the seeds of some ideas for Queer Asia 2019. Just before we head off to the wine reception and the exhibition that's happening in the cloisters, just some more thanks are due. We wanted to thank the sponsors who have made this panel particularly possible, but also for the incredible amount of support they've given all of us who've been working at Queer Asia. So we want to thank the SOAS China Institute, particularly Professor Steve Sang. We want to thank CGS, Dr. Gina Heathcote, and Professor Naja Al-Ali for their incredible support and late-night emails. And we want to thank the SOAS South Asia Institute, particularly Dr. Navtej Burwal and Professor Edward Simpson, who have also made this panel possible and sponsored the wine reception. So we hope that you will enjoy this. Just a word on the conversations. The way in which the film festival and the conference is arranged is you will never be able to see everything, but we want you to engage with the many conversations that are possible by going to as many things as possible. So that's why it's like that. It's chaotic, it's messy, it's hectic, but that's what it is. And so please join us at 8 p.m. In the cloisters upstairs for Neong's performance that will then become part of the exhibition. Thank you once again for this amazing